系はどんな言葉を持っているのだろう。トランピオ 4D 新登場。
背中には2人を酔わせるハートがある。日本初ザ・ミッドシップ MR2 トヨタから誕生。23、24はミッドシップの日。
Hey guys, about time to get going. That time of the week, it's time to learn something cool with our homies. And yeah, just so you guys know, full disclaimer, this conversation is being recorded. It will be posted on YouTube for people who are unable to attend tonight. Do not say anything that you do not want to be on the internet. If you're not comfortable swearing, I'm comfortable swearing and having it on the internet. I do it every single day. So that's me. Whatever floats your boat, you do as you will. But this is your disclaimer that is legally required here. So with that being said, Connor, you want to kick us off and give us a summary of what happened in Japan in the 1980s, I guess post-war era for Japan, through the 1980s that ultimately led to 30 years now of stagnation since 1991 with no GDP growth.
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely take the reins on that. So basically, post-war era, the United States rolled into Japan, and they welcomed us with open arms, right? And me and Mike actually watched a documentary yesterday called Princes of the Yen. And they said that the Japanese citizens basically had the minds of 12-year-olds, and we were able to mold them in a way to push our ideologies. And they adapted our ideologies, which led to an insane boom in the 80s. What we didn't know was that they were doing kind of a capitalism, communism light. And it ended up imploding on them, giving them stagnation all the way until today.
Yeah, so that pretty much sums it up. They had something, the reason he says communism light is, they had the capitalistic ideals that we had put into their economy. They had a free market, which you need in capitalism, different than they had in imperial Japan, and they were booming, but they had one policy they had is called window guidance, where they had the Central Bank of Japan telling the smaller banks who they were going to lend money to and how much money they needed to lend every quarter. They had quotas where they had a very generous lending policy, put money in the economy, inflate your yen. It's okay as long as the GDP grows, and their GDP was growing to the point where people were projecting it to eventually overtake the United States as the world's largest, best economy. The U.S. politicians were talking to the leaders of Japan as to how we could run our economy better. That's how good they were doing. It was all artificial, is what we came to find out. And it turns out that, because of that kind of window guidance, that's something you see in a communistic society where they tell the banks who to give money to. There's no money in, communism, though. So that's a little bit different. They decide who the winners are, and they decide what's important for the country at that time. And that's who gets the money. Now, when they got very generous, it was, they had high quotas so that they could get more money into the economy, get it booming even more, where they were giving money to anybody. And then eventually they kind of clamped down a little bit, and they decided which industries were going to get money and which ones just weren't. And then eventually they just shut it off altogether. So that led to a massive bubble growing and a massive bubble getting popped that they purposely held down, to this day. They never inflated their currency past that point, so they stopped growing.
Not only, that you hit on that we were learning from them, the Senate, the United States Senate, was holding Japanese productivity lessons. So we were looking at Japan, seeing how well they were doing, and we were trying to adopt the policies that they were using in order to improve our economy. They were paying kids first years in college up to 100,000 to 200,000 yen to come work for these companies because they were so they were starving for staff. They needed productivity because GDP was an all-time high, and the yen was more powerful than ever.
Yeah. So again, if anyone has anything they want to add at any point during the conversation, we have a queue building up of people raising their hands. We'll call you up here, and you can add whatever you want to add, and we'll send you back down. No hard feelings, but just to keep it structured that way. I think we've given a pretty, nice summary as to what happened there. Of course, there's some minutia we can go over throughout the duration of this conversation. We got over an hour to cover it. Maybe it's a good idea that we start with some questions if no one has anything else they want to add before then. I know Sledge, Preston was the one who recommended Princess of the End. Great recommendation. Do you have anything you want to add, Preston?
I just think it was interesting that because they had insane growth after World War II, because they maintained that wartime economy, that kind of like all hands on deck, like Elon Musk stopped screwing around and building spaceships. Like we need like manufacturing, we need to pump it into productivity, manufacturing, and they were printing hella money and they were shoving it right into industry. And that worked out for a while because it works out if not all money printing is bad. I think that's the big lesson from this is that what the economist Richard Werner, the guy who created this, he argues at the end, he's like, not all money creation is bad. Like if you print money and you invest it into production, like productive activities, like tech and stuff like that, then that doesn't cause it. I mean, the result of that is growth without inflation. It's when you start printing money and you direct that into speculation or consumption, that's what gets you in trouble, and that's what causes asset bubbles. But the insane growth that Japan experienced after World War II, it's funny because they attributed it, like you said, to the genius of Japanese managers. And they were Japanese like U.S. people were like hiring Japanese managers as speakers because of their, supposed genius. When it was just the very organized money printing into productive industries, and that works out until it doesn't. So yeah,
it's interesting that you bring up like money printing because we look at inflation. It's such a scary word today, right? You see in the news, like, are we headed to hyperinflation? Everybody's using it as a buzzword, and you're absolutely correct. What really crippled Japan's economy was deflation, crippling deflation. They wouldn't release any stress on their economy because their yen remained so strong, but their economy was crashing. So the separation of wealth just kept increasing and increasing and increasing, basically suffocating the market when the only prescription was to print money. That also brings me to another fact of they were doing it on purpose. They go on record to say that they were trying to change the economic structure of Japan, and the only way to do it is in crisis. And that, I thought, was an interesting point. We have a pretty good overview now, so I guess I'll kick it off with a question for the room now for everybody to get involved, unless you want to add something, Sledge.
I was just going to say that, like, the central bank can interfere in the economy. The economist argues, the economist that created the document, in a good way. Like, what the central bank is supposed to do is, in a depression, kickstart the economy by printing money, right? But when there's periods of high growth and everything's dandy, they're supposed to kind of curb growth with, like, tight monetary policy, right? In this situation, the Bank of Japan, the central bank of Japan, did the opposite. On the way up, when everyone was, when demand for money was high and they kept pushing those quotas, like that window guidance, they literally told the commercial banks how much they had to lend. And a lot of people think that interest rates are the source of growth and money printing, but in this case, it wasn't. It was legit credit creation, not just interest rates. And the Bank of Japan, that was their domain, is they got to tell the commercial banks literally how much they had to lend out. They had a minimum, they had quotas. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing that. And when you have no more legit investments to lend to, and you still have money that you have to lend through this window guidance policy, then they have to start expanding into riskier and riskier investments. And that's what kept happening. Like they directed growth in a very good way for a while into production, but they kept the quotas kept raising, and these banks had no choice but to start lending it out to not only productive, relatively safe ventures, but to speculators and people that just want to buy a new house or want to go long on a stock, and buy a low cap stock or something like that. And so they kept doing that, and then that's when the bubble started inflating, and then what you talked about, they all of a sudden just cut it off, and they came in and they tightened, and then crash. Stocks started plummeting, people started defaulting on their debt, real estate plummeted. I've got some numbers here so y'all can wrap your mind around what this recession was like quantitatively. So from 1990. The 1990s is what was considered the lost decade in Japan. And from 1990 to 2003, there was 212,000 companies that went bankrupt. Stocks dropped a total of 80%. Their version of the S&P stock index dropped 80% over 13 years. And then real estate at the same time dropped 84%. So that's the kind of magnitude that we're talking about. And on the way down, they cut off the money printer, and they tightened monetary policy. And so people were suffering, people were struggling to feed their families, the unemployment rate was through the roof. Suicide was the leading cause of death in Japan at this time. And that's when they cut the money printer off, when they needed it most. So instead of curbing speculative growth and kind of feeding or spurring economic growth when there's a depression, they did the opposite. So on the way up, when times were good, they just kept the money printer rolling, inflating the bubble with stocks and real estate. And then after the crash, or during the crash too, when people needed it most, they completely cut off the money printer, and people suffered. And they did that, like you mentioned, to institute political change, economic change, and whatnot.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that for the people in the audience, the key takeaway was, the faucet was on, and then they just turned it off. You could go get a loan in Japan. Let's just say you're trying to buy a house for $200K. They would say, not only are we going to give you the $200K, we're going to give you 200 more. Like, that's what we were dealing with. Well, that's what they were dealing with. And when you turn that faucet off, those are the consequences. So, knowing what we all know right now, what similarities do you guys see with Japan's economy in the 1980s and then the economy that we're seeing in the United States today? And then we'll open up the room. If anybody in the crowd has anything to say, just raise your hand and we'll call you up.
And then real quick too, I am dropping links in the Discord right now, so that y'all can follow along, relating to Japan's GDP. We'll be, dropping links in there and resources based on anything we're talking about throughout this conversation. If you want to access the Discord, you can just go to my Twitter through my bio or my Instagram. The link is in there. So just so y'all know.
Yeah, I'll start here, I guess, with some low-hanging fruit, obviously being that the U.S. in the last year, after one of the greatest stock market bull runs and one of the longest stock market bull runs in history, has had obviously the coronavirus pandemic, and a lot of stocks had a knee-jerk reaction to that. And subsequently, we printed well over 50% of what our former money supply was in just the last 2 years in reaction to the pandemic. And I think kind of tacking onto what Sledge said about saving your bullets or your ammo as a central bank for when a country is in a crisis, and making sure that you have your tools, your interest rates, and your credit creation in order to stimulate the economy at a point where the U.S. has already used those tools in such a massive, unprecedented way in the last 2 years. If we do crash, it leaves us in a very dire position without a lot of options.
So, I've kind of got a question here. Maybe taking a step back, I kind of in the overview you were mentioning that the Japanese economy was, starting with these are kind of lending out for these investments that ended up getting riskier and riskier and riskier. You know, I was hoping you could shed a little bit more light on that. Like, what are some examples of kind of some safer investments versus, you know, what were they investing in as far as lending out for getting riskier and riskier? And then I guess the second part to that, is that directly to the citizen, or is that to you know, I know it's via the banking system, but is that mainly to the everyday citizen or to corporation?
So, you know, very similar to what we saw in 2008. Like, this will give you an idea of the riskiness, right? The reason I think Michael Burry pointed to for seeing the housing market, or one of the reasons he saw for seeing the housing market coming to a utter collapse, was that they saw bartenders getting second and third mortgages on homes that, you know, they probably couldn't even afford one for the most part. They didn't have the income to support, you know, multiple mortgages, that's for sure, because interest rates were so low. This is in Japan now. They're taking out big mortgages that they can't pay back in the event that interest rates were to go up. And so they're giving out loans to pretty much anyone who breathes, because interest rates are, one, so low, everyone wants to borrow, and they've got these quotas instilled in them by the Central Bank of Japan that they need to hit every single quarter, you know, to follow the guidelines. So it doesn't matter if this person wants $200,000 for their second mortgage and they only make, you know, $20,000 a year. We're going to give them $400,000 because that's our job. We need to make sure we hit our quotas, and we don't have enough demand for loans right now to hit those quotas. So the people who are demanding the loans, we need to give them more than they're asking for.
Yeah, Cass, normally, yeah, we're talking about people like you and me, like consumer loans from banks. Like, if you want to start a business, normally you would go to a bank with a whole detailed business plan. You would explain to them that your plan, how are you going to use the money, your budget, and even then they might deny you. Like, people would apply for loans to banks normally, and banks would deny a lot of people that they thought were risky. You know, they'd be like, oh, I don't think this schmuck can pull this off, or this schmuck doesn't know what he's talking about. They would deny a lot of people that applied for loans. In this case, banks were actually searching out people, like pressuring people to take their money. They were searching out ventures, anyone that they can find with an idea about how to invest money, or just use it to consume, or just like speculate in the stock market. Like, this was completely turned on this head in the fact that the banks were actually seeking out consumers to give loans to, rather than consumers seeking out banks to get loans from.
And on top of that, on the way up during the boom, housing prices or land prices skyrocketed, obviously. So one landowner who might own a small piece of land became rich overnight. And now if he wants to get another loan, not only is the government pressuring banks to give him a loan, but he could use his property that has recently been exploded in value as collateral, which gives the banks more financial justification of it being a safe play, even though it's probably false. And then once that one little catalyst flips, then it all just comes crashing down.
Yeah, I kind of want to give, because I gave some numbers for on the way down, the crash. I want to give some, let's get a little bullish here. Let's talk about, what happened on the way up. So, from 1985 to 1989, stocks rose 240%, and land prices rose 245%. It was just like it is now. Stocks only go up. And at one point, just the garden around the Imperial Palace of Japan, just the garden area around it, was worth as much as the entire state of California. And here's another. Japan is 1/26th the size of the U.S. Their land in total is 1/26th the size, and in total their land was worth 4 times the U.S. land, land value in the U.S. And there's a quote that says, every day seemed like a festival. And this is pretty interesting. Even manufacturing companies and car makers like Nissan opened up a branch of their company just to speculate in the stock market with borrowed money. And during this time, they made more from that venture, that branch of their company, They made more from speculating the stock market with borrowed money than they did from selling cars. So
That's insane. The last part, I didn't even realize that, Sledge. I was going to piggyback off what you were saying about the land value in Japan, because that's one of the most talked about topics when you bring up, lost decade of Japan, is the land value. The Imperial Gardens land value is mind-boggling. That could be worth more than California. And how does something like that happen? Well, they were throwing all this money into the economy, but like we said earlier, everyone hears inflation and they get scared. But what you need to be, because they think of hyperinflation, from World War II Germany, or I guess pre-World War II Germany, Venezuela right now, many other nations as well in between. But inflation's not a bad thing. Inflation, at a healthy rate, is going to grow at 2 to 3% annually. All that you need to make sure of is that your GDP, so the growth of your country, outpaces it. The same way that you would lever up either your own portfolio or you lever up your company. Taking money, reinvesting it into yourself, making sure things continue booming, but they got to continue booming for it to really be impactful. Now, they inflated their yen, but the yen became so strong globally that the wealth gap just grew tremendously. So the poor stayed poor, the rich got insanely rich, and so the value of the land around the Imperial Gardens, that's how it became, more valuable in the entire state of California, is because the yen was so powerful and it just hadn't been inflated enough, essentially.
Aiden, you got like a question or something to add?
I do. I have a comment back on Preston's numbers for bankruptcies in Japan. And Preston, it was 200,000 that you said for that number?
Yeah, throughout the 90s, 212,000 companies went bankrupt.
Okay, so in the U.S. in 2020, it was roughly 540,000 companies applied for bankruptcy, different chapters, given different strategic alignments afterwards. But the first half of the year actually was 50% more than 2019 in terms of bankruptcy filings. And then 2020 ended up being the lowest amount of filings since 1980, after starting 50% above 2019 for the year. Just comment based on the comparison that you were looking for earlier, and how the government's intervention and spending. I mean, no one's looking for money right now because they're not being called to repay their debts.
Yeah, I wish I gave a percentage, because 212,000 sounds like a lot, but we have no idea, like, the total number of companies that makes up. And yeah, you're right, the U.S. sounds a lot larger with 500K. Yeah, and during this time, actually, the government was doling out stimuluses, and they did 10 stimulus packages on the way down that were worth 146 million yen. And yeah, I wish they gave these in percentage terms, because I don't know how much even yen that is. Like, that could be, that could be $5. I don't know how much like the forex is, but no, I see what you're saying.
Well, I was more making the comment of, I mean, yeah, it's not directly comparable there, especially Japan's economy to the U.S., I guess, now versus the 90s, but more of the sense of, I think it's crazy that 2020 alone for the first half had 50% more filings than the first half of 2019, and then it ended up being the lowest amount since 1980 for a year, a calendar year.
Yeah, that's insane, Aiden. So the conclusion there is just that the stimulus was successful, or that are you saying that it went too far and like the results are just unnatural?
I would say unnatural, and maybe just kind of kicking the can down the road. I mean, at some point, it's hard to even say that it has to stop, but just the way that these packages are coming out. But the way that it started, and the acceleration to ending up being the lowest record year in 30 years was just pretty astonishing to me when I read that research report.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Japan, the stimmies didn't work per se, because at the same time that the government was doling out these stimulus packages to save companies and consumers, the central bank, which is separate from the government, apparently, was selling their assets. Yeah, they were selling their assets at the same time that the government was pumping money into the economy. So it kind of, the central bank selling their assets, it takes money from the economy, right? Like if you sell their assets, people buy them, and usually what a central bank can do is buy assets in the economy, and that helps contribute to, that's just another form of stimulus, right? But the government and the central bank were actually at odds with each other at this time. So at the same time that the government was doing all it can to save its citizens, the central bank kept buying assets and like taking money from the economy at the same time the government was injecting money into the economy. So that might be an interesting thing to keep an eye on, if the Fed is buying assets right now while these stimmies are being doled out.
So, I do want to talk about that more later as well. I just had one question that we were talking about earlier that we wanted to get you all thinking on, because this is becoming an increasingly debated topic amongst economists right now. So just relating back to Japan now and what we know that they did, and they're just lending out money, and their GDP is continuing to grow, and then eventually they shut off the money, and they raised interest rates, and all went to shit. So the question is, do you think that the extremely generous lending policies seen in Japan during the 80s could potentially go on forever, so long as GDP growth outpaces inflation? And then piggybacking off of that one step further, do you think that that would cause the wealth gap to grow too large, like we saw in Japan every time now, so that recession always becomes a necessity for the sake of stability?
I guess, like I mentioned earlier, like the only way GDP grows at the same time as loose-ass monetary policy, like printing this money that you're talking about, and with this window guidance, is if that money is taken and invested in productive activities. So building a business, that's the only thing that increases GDP, your output, right?
Right.
It's not, I guess, the amount of money that's being printed. If you have just people, just like awesome entrepreneurs in your country that are willing to take that and are able to take that money and do productive things with it. Where you get in trouble is when people take that money and start either consuming or speculating with it, and providing nothing to GDP while increasing the country's debt. That's why people like to look at debt to GDP. That's kind of a signal of like how much of the money is being used unproductively versus how much of the money is being used productively towards GDP.
Right, and I think production is a very important aspect of that. We can, I guess, touch on production for Japan and where they got into trouble and where they're still in trouble. But also we got to keep in mind too that as long as that money stays within the country's economy, where it's going into the country's businesses, you can use it whether you want to use it for business or not. But you can use it for just typical expenses, because that's going to help the economy continue moving. It's when it starts to wiggle out of the country and flood into other countries' economies that you get into trouble, and that's what Japan saw as well in the 80s. Their money was just wiggling out of the country. The productivity aspect that you mentioned, though, the interesting stat brought up in Princes of the Yen was that Japan, they statistically have the longest, I think, longest life expectancy of their people. So these people, when they become unproductive members of society and they have to retire, they're old people, but they're living longer than anyone in any other country. And at the same time, they have one of the lowest, if not the lowest, birth rates in the country or in the entire world as well right now. So just as quick as these people are getting pushed out and they have to retire and they can't be productive members of society, they don't have enough people coming in to replace them anymore. So you have a labor issue where they can't be productive as a country.
Adding to that also is they just don't really like immigrants, right? And they are pretty closed off both culturally and like politically. And so the U.S. somewhat has the same problem, right? We've been having declining birth rates for decades now, and it's below the replacement rate now. But our saving grace is that we still just have a really robust immigration inflow into the country, like keeping our total population growth at pretty sustainable levels. But if that ever went away, I think population-wise we'd be in a pretty similar state as Japan.
Yeah, that's interesting, Mike, because I remember them talking about it in the documentary, but I didn't think of it as the catalyst. Because as soon as like Japan started becoming this kind of model for the world, like everyone was like, "Oh my God, like Japan's growing, their GDP is growing." Insane. Like, how do we do that? How do we replicate that? They started, and they were kings of the world at one point. And at that point, they started investing. They started buying assets in America. Like they said, some Japanese investors. I mean, the Japanese, they bought Columbia Pictures, like the Hollywood studio, and they bought part of the Rockefeller Center in New York. And it was kind of like China, where they would invest in other countries, but they were totally, they didn't let other countries invest in them. So they were getting richer, profiting off of other people's countries while kind of keeping it closed off to foreign investors investing in them. So I thought that was interesting, and it could be, a catalyst for money leaving the country, not circulating around Japan where they needed it and where they were printing it.
Yeah, I mean, not only did they buy Columbia Pictures, which is Sony today, they owned 75% of Los Angeles, the city. Like, these guys were pumping out growth. Like, they were killing it. Absolutely killing it.
And just like on the flip side of that, you look at this whole situation, you think, who was the winner here? It was actually like investment funds in the U.S. And I don't know if they were behind this, but I like to look at who profited from this situation and think that they might be behind it. After the crash and after everything was just absolutely devalued, just wrecked in Japan, that's when the U.S. came in, and that's the structural change that they're talking about. Like, they engineered this crisis, according to the author, to institute structural change, and the question is, like, what kind of structural change? And you look at what happened afterwards in the aftermath. The U.S., like, the IMF came in and basically forced the Japanese to allow foreign investors onto their land, and that's when U.S. Investment funds. And it's interesting, even the guy that engineered, the governor of the Bank of Japan, who, like during this time, who basically engineered this crisis, this bubble, he was an advisor to Goldman Sachs, or became an advisor to Goldman Sachs. And it talked about at the end, they call them vulture funds, like U.S. vulture funds, like came in and scooped up all of the demolished, undervalued assets at the end of the bubble. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because I was just gonna elaborate on that a little bit more. We touched base on it earlier in the conversation, but we got things moving. That guy's name is Yasushi Mieno. And so from 1984 until 89, now you got to realize the Central Bank of Japan, obviously they got a hierarchy within there. So he was the deputy governor, so that's not the highest position, but they're responsible. He was the one responsible for creating this bubble in the first place from 84 to 89. And so under him, we saw the yen grow, significantly stronger than it had been in a long, long time. But eventually inflated so much that we talked about that land prices began to skyrocket. The wealth gap began to grow way too large for a capitalistic society to be maintained. That's the issue we know today. We need a stronger middle class in order to keep things together. So yeah, that wealth gap grew too large, and then in '89 he became the governor, still the head of the Bank of Japan, until 1994. And so seeing that massive wealth gap he created, he was the one who then created the bubble and popped it. And he was seen as a national hero when he raised interest rates, cut off government loans for lands for the sake of deflating the currency and shrinking the wealth gap. But he never pumped more money into the economy. And then the world economists told him they needed to do a bailout. They needed to get more money flowing through the economy so that it would get unhalted. Things would resume again. GDP would grow again. And he took existing money from the economy and made that bailout, which does nothing. It doesn't inflate your currency. It doesn't really get things jump started at all. It just continues that state of stagnation. And he knew what he was doing, and he was gone on record, like we brought up earlier, in saying that he knew what he was doing. He knew that the recession would continue until more money and real bailouts got pumped into the economy, but they needed this economic crisis for the sake of changing the economic system as they knew it. Essentially, they needed to make a big change. The only way you could do that is by making someone bleed.
Yeah, that was maybe the worst part of the whole thing, is that after this, Richard Werner talked about like all these different ways that the central bank could have intervened during the crash. To intervene, ways they could have intervened in the economy to actually jumpstart it again. Talked about them being able to print money and buying assets in the market, print money and buying the assets of these commercial banks, which were just dog shit at this point. They're worthless, but it's nothing to the central bank because it's free money. They can print money and buy whatever. So even if they bought rotting assets and sold them later, they would still be at a profit. Instead, and they were doing this the entire time on the way up, just injecting money. But then when people are suffering, they turned around and they said, oh, there's nothing the central bank can do. Like, we need to tighten monetary, because loose monetary policy is what got us into this mess. So we need to tighten up, and we can't print any more money. And they ended up making the taxpayer foot the bill. They ended up using tax money to bail out these banks. And that's maybe the worst part of the whole thing.
So sorry, Mike, if you're going to say something, but just to carry off on that, my kind of thought this whole time is is y'all's takeaway from this, and please correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding here, but the issue is they were loaning out money, it crashed, and then that's when they tightened it up, and that's kind of what was the downfall. Would y'all say that the takeaway is at that point you kind of got to dance to the one that brung you? It's like they did it backwards. Whereas you should be tightening up when things are good, and loosening up your monetary policy when you need a little stimulus in the economy. Would y'all say in that case, obviously hindsight's 20/20, but they should have said look, now's not the time to tighten up. We got to keep going.
Absolutely, but not in the way that they were. There's a way to inject money into the economy. There's better ways to inject money into the economy than others. And the way they were doing that on the way up, they had a period of growth where they were loaning out money to entrepreneurs, very good entrepreneurs, and to existing industries mostly. Proven industries and proven companies. And it was a period where people would work at the same, company their entire lifetimes and stuff like that. But then they just became irresponsible, and they started lending money to speculators in the stock market, people that just wanted to buy a second house, stuff like that. So I do agree in a way that they should have been looser in their monetary policy on the way down. Obviously when suicide was the leading cause of death, but not in the way that they were. You don't lend money to people to invest in the stock market. You lend money to people so they can contribute to your GDP, so they can do valuable things.
And look at where it differs today versus what they did then. Because what we're seeing today, I'd argue, is very similar to the kind of economic simulation, artificially, that they were going through then. The main difference is we know what their ultimate downfall was. The wealth gap grew too large, right? Or that's one of the many downfalls. But the wealth gap grew too large because they gave money to businessmen, like he said, Sledge said, entrepreneurs, people who were going to use it, people who were smart enough to use it, for the sake of growing their own wealth and building giant businesses that were going to build Japan's wealth as well. But they weren't bringing up the poor. along with them. So what we're seeing today is very similar, where they're giving out these PPP loans in the beginning of the pandemic to stimulate the economy, keep small businesses booming, giving stimulus checks, free tendies to everybody. But then what are they doing in addition to that? They're giving these absurd amounts of unemployment additional benefits that people typically wouldn't get, to where people in the very beginning, if you remember, they were making more money than they would have been otherwise. So that way they're bringing up the poor, along with, the rich are getting richer, but the poor are sure as hell getting poorer too. So they're making sure that that gap doesn't grow too large. That's the only difference I really see between what we're seeing, this past year versus what Japan saw throughout the whole entire decade of the 80s.
Hey, Mike, I haven't read a lot about how the wealth gap contributes to the asset bubble. I'm just missing the link. Where does that actually become a problem outside of just like ideas about fairness and like how a society should be structured? Like, how does that actually lead to financial distress?
Right. So, well, for starters, the poor, if they don't have land to begin with, they sure as hell can't afford land that, the yen has become so strong during this whole decade, right? And it hasn't inflated at a high enough rate for that to be spread around the entire economy for them to receive some of those yen as well. So they can't afford to pay for the land that is increased in value along with inflation, because they haven't reaped the benefits of this economic boom like all the rich have as well, like all the business people have. So, poor are just too poor to really afford anything. Prices in the economy are going up as well, just like you see during, any period of inflation, which is, prices always go up. They very rarely go down, even when interest rates go up. Interest rates go up and the prices go up along with it, and they eventually raise the interest rates. Poor couldn't afford anything. If they took out any loans, they couldn't even afford those. They all defaulted. So that's the issue with the wealth gap. There is just that, all the prices in the economy inflated along with the currency, but the poor weren't getting enough of the currency to afford anything.
And I think you have to have a certain degree of like financial literacy to capitalize on a situation like this. Like, it was only the big brains at the institutions that realized what was going on, and like, oh my gosh, they're pumping insane amounts of money into the economy. Like, we got to take advantage of this. They take that. They're like, we got to. Like, I'm not holding cash, that's for sure. We got to shove our money into assets. And so you get the big brains that know the macro and know what's going on. Like some institutions are doing now, like their momentum trading. They're taking advantage of this insane and speculative and just to be like inflationary environment. Whereas, and you get some apes along the way that also profit off that too. You get the highest degree of the IQ curve and the lowest degree of the IQ curve. People are just aping into stocks forever. They get richer, but then you leave out this huge chunk in the middle class that's just wants to just go to their job, make some money, put it in a 401k, put it in their savings. They're getting wrecked throughout this whole throughout this environment. So I think that is also what contributes to the gap, like you were saying.
And then Travis, I'm not sure if I answered your question. I'll let whoever was about to speak. Throwing a link as well in the Discord for just what a massive wealth gap will do to any economy, not just Japan.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we have to remember that there were two parties running the show, the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan, both at odds with each other when this thing was all pumping. So I'm going to get some closing statements here, maybe get a couple more questions in, and then if anyone from the crowd has anything to say, feel free to raise your hand. We'll call you up. But quick question. We know that we know that Japan has had little growth with GDP over the last 30 years, and they were the leading consumer in the world in the 80s, basically, compared to the United States. In 2008, why did the United States rebound so fast from a crippling recession while Japan still hasn't recovered?
They printed money.
And I think we have the backstop of our dollar and its strength and its ties to the rest of the world economy, and those interests, in some ways, ending up propping us up.
Hey, Mike, I just want to say I was reading that article you sent on income inequality. I've got to say, just at first glance, I don't know if I agree with a lot of this. That might be a good topic for next week, is the effects of income inequality. It looks like a lot of it might just be correlation without causation at first glance. So I feel like that could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm reading through it right now. I agree with you. So I'm just trying to touch up on that as well, because you guys got to remember I majored in history, modern philosophy, and I do online marketing for a living. So this is all stuff that I am learning as I go along. Although I like to think I know it well enough to at least present it in here. But yeah, this is very interesting, Travis.
You guys want to dive into the IMF and how jacked up that is?
Right now or later?
Right now, because they talk about it in Princes of Yen and how they basically just move in to these central banks and tell them what they can and can't do and set up shop and make them leverage their money against the U.S. dollar.
So I don't know a ton about it, but I always thought that they only kind of swooped in whenever the country had already screwed up in some way, and that the idea is that they would be some type of international safety net for central banks who had mismanaged their country's economies. Did they swoop in beforehand, you're saying, or do you think it was kind of like predatory that they swooped in after? I just don't know a ton about their intervention.
No, you're right, Travis. They swooped in after the economy was a mess, or maybe halfway down. But they're the ones that came in and they enforced further quantitative tightening. They were the ones that came in and be like, oh, money printing got you into this situation. You got to cut off all money printing and just starve your people who are starving for money and credit and loans to get the economy jump-started. And so it seemed like their goal was to like crush commercial banks and help central banks, because that was the result, at least. And they're the ones that actually they instituted the policy to allow foreign investors to invest to bail out the commercial banks. So instead of the central bank, like the domestic, representative bank to come in and actually bail out these banks and stuff and hold their assets within the country, they were the ones that came in and were like, nah, you got to open this up internationally. Like, we know better than you. Globalism is key. And so they came in and they allowed U.S. investment banks like Goldman Sachs to actually come up and buy these banks in distress from Japan.
And then adding on to that, I thought one of the really interesting things the documentary said on that front was when then in 2008, the U.S. economy crashed, they changed the rules for the first time. And there's a number of other examples that he brings up in that documentary where other economies had crashed. The IMF came in and always they had a term where you only get bailed out if you allow foreign investors to come in and be the bailout money. Whereas in the U.S., maybe that is one of the answers to the former question of why was the U.S. able to recover so quickly? Maybe because we were able to control our own outcomes in a way that other countries were not.
Exactly. I was going to hit on that. Sledge, you answered with one simple statement. We printed money. When we tell everyone else, you can't print money. We play by different rules, and you got to think about an underlying conspiracy there.
Yeah, it seems pretty conspiratorial to me. I'm usually pretty anti-conspiracy, but it makes sense. I feel like the counter argument though is that, thinking about this optimistically, the IMF could have just in good faith thought that the best way to get money flowing through the economy again is to allow foreign investment, right? Like those are the only people confident enough to start buying, right? If your domestic population is so scared of the deflationary pressures in your economy, they're not going to buy anything, then it doesn't matter how much stimulus you print. Like Sledge was saying earlier, they're just going to sit on their cash because it's going to be worth more tomorrow than it is today. They're not going to spend on anything, whereas foreign investors, would. I feel like that's an optimistic way to view what the IMF did, but I don't know. I could be be swayed either way.
That's why it's so important too, Travis, that the interest rates stay, as low as possible. I mean, in Japan, theirs were in the 80s, even lower than ours are today, and at 0.5%, that's the lowest I've ever seen it, I think, or any of us have ever seen it. And what that does is it does a couple things, right? It incites the ability to borrow money with, less risk than you would ever see otherwise, typically. So that's good. They're going to borrow money, they're going to spend it. But what do you do to make sure that they're not going to save it? You got to keep them low enough, because when it sits in their bank account and you're inflating this currency at, 2 to 3% at a healthy rate, for example, it's going to inflate at a higher rate than your money's going to grow in a bank account, or it's going to grow in a government bond. If the interest rate is 0.5%, the government bonds that we buy into is not 0.5%. It might grow at a little bit lower clip than that, but that's what it does. It creates, I guess, more risk adversity, is the way I'd put it. Is you can't let it sit. You can't afford to let it sit, or your money's going to be worth less next year than it is today if you don't do anything with it.
Yeah, and I guess that only works, though, if there is actually good investments to be made, right? Like if you're just keeping interest rates super low, and yeah, you can borrow for next to nothing, or even like more recently, they've had negative interest rates, right? Like the government's literally paying you to take money and spend it. But if you don't have any quality investments to make, it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, what drives the engine of growth is, good ideas and people who are actually, going to be successful entrepreneurs. If you have an entire economy that's just kind of stagnating with ideas and productive capital, like it doesn't matter how cheap the money is, you're not going to be able to stimulate that very well.
That's interesting you bring it up too, because we touched on it a little bit earlier about how when we first got there, post World War II liberation, and what we did there. I mean, when you look at it, it's pretty fucked up. Where we took away their culture. I mean, they were happy for it, sure, because we created this economic boom for them of capitalism, introduced to them. But they didn't think that way beforehand. They lived their entire lives not ceasing opportunity the way that we do in a capitalistic society. It's what you can do for your country. And when they created the system of window guidance, where they're hand-holding the people who run the banks of the country and telling them where to lend money, when they finally shut that off and they got rid of window guidance, these guys, they didn't know how to think still, because that's what happens when you combine communism and capitalism. I don't want to harp on that. That could be a topic for a different day. But they handhold and they handhold and they handhold, and these people never learned to think for themselves still because of that. So when they finally turned off window guidance, the lenders had no idea who to lend to or what they should lend for. So that was an issue in and of itself. It's you brought up the entrepreneurial mindset. They just didn't have it. They never had to develop it yet, because they had their hand held the entire way.
Yeah, I mean, the whole history of Japan just absolutely blows my mind, because I feel like pretty much the exact same thing that we have been talking about, like in the post-war period, happened right before that, in the pre-war period, starting in like the 50s and 60s. We basically gave them industrialization and like railroads and modern manufacturing and stuff, and they became overnight basically the greatest, or one of the greatest, countries in the world, and just a true superpower that could compete with the U.S. just out of nowhere. Where in the 1840s they were just a very poorly developed country, just kind of a nobody. And then we decided, okay, that's enough of that. And then pretty much right after that, the post-war period, you saw the same thing, where we gave them modern, like, financial and capitalist techniques, and they again became the greatest country in the world. And if the conspiracy theories are to be believed, we said, okay, enough of that again. We need to take that away too. So I feel like the U.S. has just had a wild relationship with Japan.
It's a very similar concept too of when you've got an ally, you're only an ally until you become a threat to them. And Japan became a threat to us, and so with the IMF, instituting that policy where these Asian countries around Japan were looking for bailouts, and Japan was willing to bail them out, and we said, nope, you can't do it. They can only get a bailout if they come to us. And it's, they became a threat, so we're going to hold them down a little bit longer. And that's what we did.
I think you guys are making a lot of more good points right now. We got like 6 minutes left. I'd love to get some more people up on stage and get a take.
We got 21 minutes left.
Oh, really? I thought I went to 15. That's my bad.
You're good. But yeah, I do want to get some people up here. If you have anything to add, I want to get Oliver up here. This guy has been studying Forex since we were in college. He's an absolute tank when it comes to I'd say at least currencies, from the very least. But he's a very smart guy. Cameron as well. Not to discredit anyone else in the audience, but those guys I think have some stuff to offer.
Thanks, Mike, for the shout out. I don't really have much to add. I made some money off the Japanese yen, but I guess my input as far as Japan goes is I've heard a lot of negative things about it, but internationally, it's my best understanding that the Japanese yen is still seen as a safe haven asset, and I just wanted to comment and provide that input.
Yeah, that was one of the anomalies is the yen maintained its strength throughout this process. The issue was that they didn't inflate it enough. So leveraged against the U.S. dollar, it was so strong that it became an issue. There wasn't enough of it circulating around, and I think it's still strong today. I'm just not up to date with the exchange rates like you may be.
Real quick to touch on that, I'd be curious to know the strength of the yen on an international standpoint. Is that, was that a relatively new kind of development in the post-war era in like the 70s, 80s, or is that been historically the case, for the last 100+ years?
I honestly can't speak to that. I just learned it in school and kind of carried it forward, but I would assume it's because of their technological innovation and how ahead they are. But yeah, that's just
in the post-war era, specifically from 84 to 89, we talked about what was his name? I think it's Yasushi Mieno. From 84 to 89, he was the one who created this bubble in the first place, and under him is where we saw the yen, which wasn't that strong against the dollar beforehand. The dollar is always what most currencies are leveraged against. It grew to all-time highs as far as strength goes against the dollar, and became one of the most valuable currencies in the world because of that, because of this GDP growth. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and this whole conversation was us talking about Japan in the 80s and 90s. So we haven't really even touched on Japan I don't even know about Japan and the yen in the 2000s. So I don't know about their recovery or what happened after that. I was just reading briefly that they had, pretty much recovered more or less by the mid 2000s, and then as soon as they got to a point where they had wiped out their losses, the Great Recession happened and kind of put them back another 10 years. People refer to the lost decade, but they also refer to the lost 20 years, and then even after that, now with COVID, people are talking about the lost 30 years. It's kind of been just back to back, and also the earthquake with Fukushima, and it's just been kind of back to back disasters for Japan since that asset bubble burst.
Right now, the exchange rate for yen to US dollar is 108 and a half. So 108 and a half yen equals $1 US now, and that's pretty strong compared to where we even saw at the beginning of the 80s, from what I remember from the documentary.
Real quick, if you're enjoying yourself, follow Teach Us Something Cool, and then we're going to meet in the Discord after to have a little chat about, the whole group. So let us know if you want the link, and we'll see you there.
So, if you guys have any topics also that you want us to talk about, any other week, we've been talking a lot about economics because it's just, what's going on right now is unprecedented. It's very easy to want to talk about economics when money is just booming. We went through a 2-week correction. Bitcoin is fun for us to talk about, but, a couple weeks ago we talked about space, and God, that was an awful conversation because none of us know shit about space. But, we got a growing list over here. We're just trying to crowdsource some ideas of what you guys want to, discuss or what you want to listen to. Because I think all of us just enjoy learning new topics every week, expanding our knowledge and just watching our knowledge compound as an entirety.
Yeah, I'm telling y'all, the Floribama Shore weekly recap series is going to get started soon, so stay tuned for that.
Johnny!
Hey, I'm Team Gus, bro. I don't care what anyone says. You cannot tell me different.
You got anything for us, John?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to ask a question.
Feel free, baby.
All right, so if you're trying to make the comparison between, like, U.S. now and Japan in the 80s, like, how do you reconcile the difference of Japan having a bank where they're straight going to people and saying, hey, we will give you, not just this much for a loan, but we will aggressively seek out people and give them ridiculous deals on loans, to where, like, the U.S. economy, like, we don't have that with terms of, like, loans and how we deal.
We don't, but I'd argue we kind of have a different form of it in the form of these corporations not really even growing their companies anymore because they know that the government is going to keep bailing them out, and so they keep buying back their stock and taking home more and more profits to the financial economy that aren't real growth. And that, I think, is a form of similarly unwise spending.
And I think the other thing, too, is, like, it's easy to see that in hindsight and say, like, oh, yeah, of course that's bad. At the time, they just thought, like, yeah, we're lending out more money than they need, but they're just going to respend that, and it's all going to lead back to growth. Like, they didn't view it as an impending crisis until the bubble had already burst. And you saw the same thing in 2008, right, where we were just, giving out mortgage loans for next to nothing and saying, like, oh, this is fine. The government's really incentivizing people to buy a home because your home is the ticket to the middle class. Like, this is going to be good for the society. But, of course, looking back on it in 2009, we said, obviously, yeah, that was a shit idea. The question today is, like, that's probably still happening. We're probably still giving shit loans somewhere, but, like, it's not always apparent until after the party ends. It's kind of hard to see it as it's happening. That's always the problem in any bubble. So we may just not be aware of the extent to it, to what extent it's going on right now.
Yeah, I've kind of, to build on that point, we're talking about, and I know it's not quite comparable, it's not the same thing, but like these stimulus checks, it's like, where do y'all rank that on a degree of, like, riskiness, right? Because the idea behind a stimulus is, as opposed to, like, these loans where it's like, hey, we'll loan you $400,000 for this, shady business, not shady, but, kind of flimsy business idea, and it's probably not going to work out, but, keep the machine rolling. But, like, the idea behind the stimulus is we give everyone this amount of money, and then it's going to be reinvested in the economy, whether it be through some healthy, amount of consumerism, and then also through, I don't know if stimulus is going to be much to get your business off the ground, but, like, where do we kind of rank that as far as riskiness, right? Because it's like, I'd just be curious to hear your feels.
I think where we differ, and if we touch back to earlier in the conversation, where the big issue of theirs was money was, sneaking out of their economy. It was going into other nations' economies. And what I think is different now, and, there's definitely still holes that money's going to sneak out of, but I think the U.S. has such a large, booming economy that we've just built over centuries now. Especially with, products like Amazon, right, where people spend a lot of money there. The thing about all the online shopping, I'm struggling right now to think of many examples of places people could spend money to where the money would leak out of the country and not just go back into our economy. What examples do y'all see there of where people are spending money? There's got to be more than I'm thinking of.
I mean, you're right. It all depends on how we spend it. And stimmies are. I prefer stimmies to directed stimulus because at least it's a fairer form of money printing. But I mean, the assets, that rise in price, or the items that rise in price, all depend on how we, the people, spend that money, which is kind of fun to think about. Because if we take those stimmies and we shove them in in our savings account, or we use them to pay off debts and stuff, then that's kind of deflationary. But if we take those stimmies
and we shove them into shit coins and penny stocks, as we kind of have been doing, like with at least from what I can tell, with the proliferation of Robinhood and just retail investing. It seems like that's where our heads are at as a people. So you are kind of feeding the machine, or we're feeding the bubble, which is, good if you know when to get out, bad if you get tied to a specific investment.
Yeah, that's a pretty solid point, Sledge. It's one is crazy. We're creating a lot of new investors. Myself, I'm not excluded from that group. I've been in crypto for a while. Really diving into the stock market this year, learning it, well beyond where I ever saw myself learning the stock market, which is cool. But you're creating a lot of investors who don't, like, they see it as another form of gambling, right? Where they're playing the pennies because it's high risk, very, very high reward. They're playing the shit coins because it's very high risk, very, very high reward. What if it becomes like Bitcoin, not really understanding how Bitcoin got to where it is today? That's kind of the mindset we're seeing. But I think it's also hilarious. On the other hand, I don't know if you guys think so too. Just watch people lose their shit over $1,400 fucking dollars. How much is $1,400 really? It's not that much money, but people are losing. They're going berserk when they get the $1,400 simi because they don't typically get handouts from the government otherwise.
I've got a question here. It's been some good conversation, but I guess surrounding the most recent comments, does investing in the stock market, benefit the economy? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No. Yes.
No.
Yes. Yes, if you hold the stocks that they're buying, individually make money, but it doesn't contribute to GDP. That's what you're asking.
I think it does indirectly, because if a lot of people are investing in the stock market, it just provides a lot of liquidity and the ability for companies to tap equity markets whenever they do have good growth prospects. And so if you just have a lot of, a robust stock market, then that's good, because that'll provide, companies with a greater ability to grow. I think what Sledge is saying is that, if someone just invests, it's not good by itself. You just past a certain point, it's not going to keep being helpful, right? It's not a one-in-one relationship. As long as you have a robust stock market, then you're good. But after a certain point, it's not that helpful.
I just feel like these companies, they don't need, all that. There's only so many good ideas that a company has, You keep throwing money at them, they're just going to keep, resorting to buybacks or these other ways to enrich shareholders. There's only so many good ideas, and just throwing money at companies, I guess you're trusting them, if they do have good ideas and they do contribute, and those companies, indirectly it may contribute to GDP, like you were saying, but at a certain point, it's just excess money that you're throwing at these companies. And there's only so many good ideas that, and so many ways that they can use that money to contribute to GDP.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're past the point where it's still helpful. I think, we've had a robust stock market for a while, and now, so many companies are doing stock buybacks just all the time because they don't have anything better to invest in, which is not a good sign.
I think it's crazy too. We're seeing this huge SPAC boom, and I see new SPACs coming out every single day. We have been for almost a year now, and there's so many shit companies that don't make money, that don't print a single dollar, aren't projected to make money for over 5 years from now. We could very well. I mean, I think there's likely that we do crash in the next 5 years. Knock on wood. I don't want anyone to lose their ass, but people are going to lose a lot of fucking money investing in these shit companies that are very futuristic. They think they could go to the moon. They're investing in a lot of space companies. It's like, well, how are you going to make money on this company? When SpaceX is leading the foundation here and, kind of paving the way for y'all, and they've still got a ways to go before they can monetize really on the public. So it's kind of scary to think about, see how many shit companies are popping up that people are putting a lot of money into that they typically wouldn't be investing into in any other times.
Yeah, 100%. Even within that, SPACs specifically for energy renewable companies are just insane right now. I mean, the total SPAC market is for, since 2020, something like $100 billion has been raised just for ESG type of companies. And you compare that to all of the technology SPACs, like everything from hardware to software, you name it, that in total is only $80 billion, right? And so the ESG industry is like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the size of the tech industry, but they've raised that much more, SPAC money, and that just screams bubble to me. I mean, it's just absolute insanity.
Yeah, the renewable energy thing you bring up is funny because that's my most recent investment is in a company called Renew Power. That's India's #1 renewable energy company, in a country that desperately needs renewable energy. So I was hoping, I know that that's your field you're in. I don't know if you're, if you know much about oil as well. What do you see going on there currently?
Those numbers I gave are U.S., and so I think that there's a lot more potential for renewable in other countries, like India especially, just because they have so many energy needs to begin with. I think in the U.S. it's totally overblown because, our energy needs are met for the most part. The only reason to switch is out of, kind of moralistic environmental concerns, whereas in India and, China to an extent, all over sub-Saharan Africa, their energy needs are real, and having renewable energy there makes a ton of sense, right? Like they can just skip a technology or a generation of technology and it'll work out great. The U.S. can't really do that.
So we've kind of gone full circle, going back to the looming crash episode last week. So I guess closing thoughts. Do you guys think that we're doomed to another crash, and are we going to follow in Japan's footsteps?
While the music's playing, you gotta dance, motherfucker.
I think, after watching what we did yesterday, Connor, I think we're similar, but we're not exactly alike to Japan. And I'm not going to be, as a history major, I'm not going to be the fucking naive person sitting there who's saying we're never going to go through another market crash again. But I do think it's very interesting to see, what healthy inflation looks like, what that does for their GDP. And I think they would have been okay if they had just maintained, wealth gap, something we need to look into further. Travis brought a lot of good points, but if they would have just made sure that didn't grow as wide as it did, made sure that the poor got brought up with the rest of the country, and I think we're doing, we're taking steps to make sure that happens here. There's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot that's different with us as well. I think we're further away from a crash than I would have told you we were a week ago. But I could just be riding that newfound feeling of euphoria again, which is typically what you find at the very end of a cycle, as Sledge brought up last week also.
I think you brought up a good point, and why that whole GameStop and Citadel and Robinhood debacle, why that resonated with so many people, because it's like, shit, like if we're bubbling, like we want equal share in the bubble, and like that, I feel like people felt that the rich were profiting, the institutions were profiting more than the little guy, and like that's the huge concern, I guess, in situations like this.
Biggest chintz of all time.
Yeah, we definitely got chintz there. We saw a little ride back this week, and we'll see what happens with GameStop. That's like, I don't typically make plays like that because I'm, again, only 25-year-old value investor in the entire world. But you've got 2 whole shares of GME sitting in my bag right now just because I want a piece of the fun.
All right, guys. Solid discussion. Sledge, thank you for all your knowledge. You were the believable party in this group today.
No doubt.
You the man. And everybody else, thanks for joining. If we have any last questions, TC, you got anything for us? I saw that you came up, haven't heard from you. And then Coombs, what's the word, man?
Well, what's going on, bro?
All good.
Sorry, I was kind of off and on my phone, railing at the Spurs game, so
yeah.
I contribute as much as I would have liked to.
Coombs, the Spurs are cheeks, bro. Hit us. You got a big ass brain in there.
Dude,
hit us with your take on the
25,
economy.
Aren't you like 32, bro?
I'm old enough to tell us something about the economy.
Okay, so maybe for another conversation, it would be cool to talk about. I mean, if you want to stick with the finance theme and you want to kind of go
with what we're going right now, going like the inflation versus deflation argument, or maybe to take it a step further, is to go like, how can you define inflation, and like what kind of like sets off a deeper inflation as opposed to just like 2-3% for inflation targeting. I think that would be pretty cool. You could also do stuff about like a war or something. I think that shit's always kind of cool to help contextualize everything that goes on. But yeah, no, sorry. Like I said, sorry I didn't contribute more. I was fucking pissed, to be frank.
It's all right, Cameron. I know you love the Spurs. I'm sorry for what they did to you.
I've never met pissed. Is she nice?
TC?
Huge bitch.
Yeah, I'll pop in here with a little comment on the stock market here. So, watching this volatility these last couple weeks, Lo, you said you feel a whole lot you feel like a whole lot further away than a market crash, than you probably were a week or two ago. But that's common, the feeling that you get right before the rug gets pulled on you. At this point, this market's shown me some resilience. I mean, stock market has never gone 18 months with crashing to a low and not recovering to a higher high, right? That's never happened in the history. So all of us here in this room, probably all young enough to endure a crash, right? So it's not so much, is a crash coming? When is it going to come? You're not going to make money anticipating that and trying to capitalize off of playing that game. Really, all of us here in our 20s, 30s, and under, just for the majority, we have time.
What are you 30-year-old here?
What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do when that axe drops? How are you gonna respond to it? What is your plan? Do you have something ready? And it takes 2 or 3 times getting kicked in it, right, before you're really gonna be able to operate under that. Because I took a substantial loss this last week, right? And it wasn't even a loss; it was just unrealized gains that I gave back. What was spoken about earlier, right? SPAC market, made a bunch of money on that in November, but the renewable energies, electric vehicle SPACs, valuations through the roof, absolutely outrageous. Got to give it up. Got to give my guy Mr. Lowe props. About 3 days prior to the crash of CCIV, he's in my ear going, TC, sell the whole bag, get rid of all the CCIV. I said, Lowe, what are you doing, my friend? You don't know anything. These numbers don't mean anything. We are going to the moon, Lowe. And we did for like another day after that. But then 2 days later, it crashed down to like $20 a share, right? Couldn't have called that any better, right? Was 2 or 3 days early on it. Got to give it up for Lowe for calling that one out. But it's just to the point that was, said earlier. The market got super overextended. It's a crowded space. There's only so many great ideas, right? There's only so much, and so there's a diminishing return to the social, to the whole social picture there, right? The only justification to really turning the whole country into meeting the energy needs would be for a moralistic reason. There'd be so much more opportunity in other parts around the globe, right? But our market right now, it's not about when it's going to crash or if it's going to crash. It will, and it's going to soon, sooner rather than later, right? Just who knows? It's the more important part is what are you going to do?
To answer your question, CT, of what are we going to do? I think luckily the answer is pretty easy this time, and that's buy Bitcoin, baby.
Oh, I would say there's so much opportunity across the whole crypto. Like, I'm looking for different ways to get exposure to it other than just simply buying Bitcoin. There is a plethora of different ways you can expose yourself to this upside here. It's insane. Does anybody? I don't know. I know we're trying to do a little wrap up, but my guy Brogan, I see my guy Brogan down here. We need to get him up as a speaker for one of these and just let him unleash some crypto thoughts.
Yeah.
Like, he's got a pretty cool idea, something going on. I'm sure he'd love to share with you guys.
Brogan is an absolute animal. Slater, he reminds me a lot of you, because you were always like way younger than me for sure, but just mature for your age. And he's 19 years old. This dude's been in crypto for like 5 years now. He's currently working on a mining project. Like he's in the know with what's going on in crypto pretty much across the entire landscape. So he'd get along pretty well with you. Pretty well with Sledge for sure. He is an absolute tank. So when Brogan, whenever you want to, Brogan, raise your hand. I'll pop you up here. You can, weigh in. We could have a whole crypto conversation one of these days, because I know, we had that when it was 6 of us in here. It was a pretty fucking fun conversation, especially when you're invested in crypto. So, I think you got a lot to contribute there.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting if we did a crypto-specific one where we got a little bit more into the mechanics of how some of the different DeFi applications work and how that replaces a lot of what is happening in today's financial world in actually real use case ways, whereas most of cryptocurrency's history has just been in speculative trading. So I think there's a lot we could go into there.
What's crypto?
What's crypto? I mean, I definitely think now crypto, it's going to go more from a speculative thing that people say, hey, let's go speculate on these coins, to, hey, what are the top 2 or 3 projects and how do we capitalize our gains and use these as an asset class? And especially now with the limit market crash, it's how do we use these projects as a hedge, because people will still love these even when the stock market takes the tank, which, staring at futures, it's coming sooner rather than later.
Hey guys, I gotta head out. Real good discussion with everyone. Thanks for hosting, Mike and Connor. I'll see you guys again next week.
Awesome, Travis. Yeah, that's probably our cue also to wrap up over here, guys. So we're going to continue discussion in the Discord if you want to talk about this one, wrap it up, and maybe talk about either next week's topic or topics you want to hear discussed. We're going to talk shop in there a little bit longer, but we're going to conclude this for now. And like I said, this will be going on YouTube if you want to watch it back. Show your friends, show your family, show whoever the fuck you want. It's going to be on there. So I've got a video editor working on that later this week, and I'll let you guys know as soon as it's live.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
No problem, fellas. Thank you, Connor. All right.
Love you guys.
Love you guys. See y'all later.
Good show. Love.
Peace.